Megan. Okay, next. How do we protect the brain? A lot of this really familiar, right? The skull. We know this. We protect the brain with the skull, specifically the cranium, because the skull extends down and also protects the face. So the cranium is the part of the skull that specifically protects the brain. Familiar with that, right? The cerebrospinal fluid, you watched a video that talked all about how it's produced and how it flows down into the spinal column and how it floods the spinal cord, protects the spinal cord between the meninges. So same thing over the brain. We have this layer of cerebrospinal fluid that's protecting the brain, and it's kind of like a shock absorber. So if you whenever you have a concussion, boom, in your head, your brain hits your skull. Okay, so what that means is that you had a whiplash or something that was hard enough to cause your brain to hit your skull, and that the cerebrospinal fluid wasn't able to protect you from that. So the cerebrospinal fluid is this watery layer of protection around the brain. We already learned about the cerebrospinal fluid, so now what we're going to get into is the blood-brain barrier. So the brain has a lot of blood, okay? A lot of arteries, a lot of blood vessels, a lot of veins that feed it, okay? Lots of stuff happening in the brain, right? So the brain, neural tissue, specifically the brain, has really intense metabolic requirements. So neural tissue has high metabolic requirements. Okay, and think back to when we learned about metabolism and all the things that go into that. So, two big important things that we need for metabolism, two big important things we need to make cellular energy are oxygen and glucose, right? And neurons, the brain, you've probably heard this before, need a constant supply of oxygen and glucose. Okay, we need oxygen and glucose in the brain. High demand. Okay, about 15% of the blood from the heart goes to the brain. Okay, and think about how big your brain is. Like if we're just thinking about our bodies, your little bitty brain compared to the entire rest of your body. Your brain is not 15% of your mass, but it gets 15% of the blood. Okay, so when we're talking about the blood-brain barrier, what we're talking about is the brain needs this blood. The brain needs blood constantly pumping through it for it to be able to do its job, for it to be able to get that oxygen and that glucose and rapid metabolism. So how is the brain protected from whatever things that are in our blood? Okay, how do we make sure that those neurons and those neuroglial cells are protected? Okay, well, oxygen wow, guys, the whole not spelling thing is just getting worse and worse. Oxygen passes freely. Okay, oxygen passes freely across the blood-brain barrier. That's how we get oxygen into the brain. Glucose, okay, the glucose, which is sort of the substrate for our cellular energy, is that we have membrane transporters. It's moved by transporters. Okay, that's how we get these two critical things into the brain so that the neurons and the neuroglial cells can use them. Interestingly, the brain, so about 15% of our blood gets pumped to our brain. About 20% of the glucose the body's entire glucose consumption? Brain. The brain is using about 20% of our total glucose. Our brain is definitely not 20% of our mass, right? The brain uses a ton of glucose. So stop and think for just a second. What is the brain doing? Think about the neuron. Think about action potentials and graded potentials. Why? Why does the brain need so much cellular energy? What's going on that causes the brain to need so stinking much cellular energy, ATP? Which of the processes in the firing of a neuron, let's just focus on that for right now, need so much cellular energy? Okay. Hopefully you thought, well, the sodium-potassium pump, right? The sodium-potassium pump. We have to get back to resting membrane potential if we're going to fire another action potential. The sodium-potassium pump uses ATP. So to get back to resting membrane potential, to keep that neuron ready to fire, and it's got to fire and get back to membrane potential, fire, get back to resting membrane potential, fire. To make this happen, we've got to use ATP, the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, so then how do we need oxygen, we need glucose to get through. How do we keep other stuff that we don't want to get through from getting through? And I'm going to pause just a second so you don't have to watch me draw this image. Okay, so we'll learn a lot more about this when we get to the circulatory system. But if we're looking at the image, the bottom of my image is as if we're looking at blood flowing through a capillary. So below the little red square things, those are representing the cells of the capillary, is the blood. The blood's flowing, right? That's what it does. And then above that, in the sort of pinkish color, is various tissues. Okay, so if we're in other places in the body, outside of the brain, then the blue arrows are representing diffusion. So all sorts of things are diffusing through those cells into the tissues from the blood, or from the tissues to the blood. So this is how we get nutrients, this is how we get oxygen, and then how the blood collects waste. Another really super important thing is that in most of the body, the cells of these capillaries are not tightly bound to each other. So this cell, there's like little kind of almost space. Not even almost space. Okay, the cells that make up the wall of the capillary, these are endothelial cells that make up the wall of the capillary. They're not super tightly bound to each other. So, and this is really important for the function of our bodies. So that means that these larger things that can't diffuse or maybe don't have a transporter, they can pass between the cells. And this may seem kind of wonky, like that seems like a bad idea, but it's really, really important in all the rest of our body to the way substances move to and from the blood into tissues and out of tissues. Okay, so that's in the other parts of the body. But we're interested in the blood-brain barrier right now. So in the brain, these cells are hanging out. Oops, if I don't use the eraser. Okay, we've got a capillary running through the brain. Okay, we've got this immense network, right? We got to deliver so much blood to the brain because it is hungry, right? Uses so much glucose, uses so much oxygen. But we've got to be really picky about what makes it into the brain. We got to be super, super picky. We have that blood-brain barrier to protect that neuronal tissue. The cool, awesome thing that does this are glial cells called astrocytes. Okay, so these glial cells called astrocytes. So I'm going to draw like an astrocyte here. Okay, so an astrocyte is a glial cell or a neuroglial cell. Remember, those neuroglial cells are like helper cells. And an astrocyte, so let's imagine this is its nucleus, like similar to oligodendrocytes, has all of these processes that come off of it. Okay? And a critical function of an astrocyte is that it comes and it puts its processes on those capillaries, and it releases something really important, okay? It releases a substance that just affects the cells that are very near to it, okay? So it releases something, comes and it's like, hey, I'm going to release this substance just right here, okay? And it's just going to affect these cells right here close to the process, or sometimes it's called the foot of that astrocyte. So what are those called? Think back. We got to go way back. That's those substances that get released that just affect adjacent cells. Okay, so an astrocyte is releasing a substance. It only affects the cells very close to it. Can you remember? Maybe go back. It's okay. Okay, so this substance that the astrocyte is releasing is a paracrine. So the astrocyte process releases a paracrine. And what that paracrine does is, instead of having these sort of loose junctions between the cells that allow things to pass through, that are critical for the function of the rest of the body, what it does is it causes those cells to have tight junctions. That's what that's called, a tight junction. So this paracrine, the astrocytes, which are glial cells, remember they're those helper cells, okay? It releases this paracrine and it promotes tight junction formation. So this paracrine promotes okay, so this is one of the functions, one of the really important functions of astrocytes, is that they promote this tight junction formation, and they're critical to the blood-brain barrier. They're critical to protecting the neural tissue. So in this case, rather than this being just any tissues, this would be the brain. Maybe. Just kidding. It's not going to let me do that. I hate it when it just won't. Brain. Weird. Okay. So that's the brain. So you don't have astrocytes other places. You have astrocytes in the brain producing the blood-brain barrier, protecting the brain. So we have the cranium, we have the cerebrospinal fluid, and then we have the blood-brain barrier all protecting the brain.